This is a reading from the epistle of 1 John, chapter 4. We have come to know and to believe in the love God has for us. God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God, and God in him. In this is love brought to perfection among us, that we have confidence on the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment, and so one who fears is not yet perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, but hates his brother, he is a liar. For whoever does not love a brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. This is the commandment we have from him. Whoever loves God must also love his brother. I also want to read this passage from the book that we are using in Sunday school, the very first paragraph of the book begins by quoting Dietrich Bonhoeffer. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. These unforgettable words of the German martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer express a fundamental truth. When Jesus calls us, our old life comes to an end and something new begins. That something, however, is not necessarily what we expect or what we want. Jesus' message is as unsettling as it is clear. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. What does this entail? What does it mean to hear Jesus' voice and follow him? To take a brief detour. As you know, I'm fascinated with everything having to do with sheep, including their history and the history of the relationship between sheep and humankind. And it's because of my fascination with sheep that I began to learn about the Black Death, the plague that rolled across Europe, originating somewhere along the Black Sea in the 1340s, eventually reaching England in 1348 and 1349. And although my interest at first was what the Black Death had to do with wool and fortunes made by the woolen trade, I also realized that it had everything to do with the economic system of capitalism that we have inherited, but especially with their conception of poverty, and that it was an instrumental force in moving us from the idea that poverty was part of the way the world is. It was just part of the world, and therefore it was the responsibility of every good Christian to care for the poor. And it moved us from that idea to the idea that poverty was an individual, personal, and moral failing on the part of someone who was poor. And it was no longer our responsibility to care for the poor. Now it was our moral and legal responsibility to reform and reshape the poor into people who no longer had moral failings. And that continues to be the dominant paradigm to this day, that poverty is a moral failing of the poor, not of our economic system. So that shift in how we consider poverty impels me to read about the Black Death, because that seems to be a moment not only for sheep, but also for humankind, in which the entire world was kind of turned upside down and remade. But as I read about the Black Death, and right now I'm reading a book called, appropriately, The Black Death by a British historian named John Hatcher. As I read about the Black Death, I can't help but notice that it was also a theological crisis. It was an actual apocalyptic event. The people who knew that it was coming to them, and they did know, it didn't take them by surprise. They had a year or 2 years to find out news about how it was traveling across Europe, and to see and to imitate all the things that were being done to try to hold it off, all of which involved confession and penitence and self-flagellation and walking to pilgrimages on your knees, and all these things being done to hold it off. And yet inexorably it kept on progressing across Europe, and nothing stopped it, nothing quenched it. And in that regard, it was, for the people of Europe of that time, an experience of a partial end of the world. When we say that it was apocalyptic, it was apocalyptic. It was the end of the world. And you read about it, I read about it at least, and wonder how anyone kept their faith in God when they believed that God was responsible for this plague and that God was bringing it to the world so that people would repent of their sins. And no matter how much repentance there was, the plague kept moving toward them. In one way in particular. And so I'm going to quote some passages from this book I'm reading, The Black Death, just to talk about the bodily effects of the plague. So John Hatcher writes, Gabriele de Musi, a lawyer in Piacenza, wrote in one of the more detailed of surviving descriptions of the plague, so that the conditions, causes, and symptoms of this pestilential disease should be made plain to all, I have decided to set them out in writing. Those of both sexes who were in good health and in no fear of death were struck by 4 savage blows to the flesh. First, out of the blue, a kind of chilly stiffness troubled their bodies. They felt a tingling sensation, as if they were being pricked by the points of arrows. The next stage was a fearsome attack, which took the form of an extremely hard, solid boil. As it grew more solid, its burning heat caused the patients to fall into an acute and putrid fever with severe headaches. As it intensified, its extreme bitterness would have various effects. In some cases, it gave rise to an intolerable stench. In others, it brought spitting of blood; for others, swellings near the place from which the corrupt humors had arisen. Some people lay as if in a drunken stupor and could not be roused. Behold the swellings, the warning signs sent by the Lord. Some died on the very day the illness took possession of them, others on the next day, others, the majority, between the 3rd and 5th day. And then Hatcher compares these contemporary descriptions, the descriptions of the plague that were written with the time, with what modern medicine thinks may have happened during the plague. While some of the symptoms given by de Musi are not unique to plague, their presence in conjunction with each other is highly significant, as are genuine buboes, the large and exquisitely painful swellings of the lymphatic glands. As modern medical texts tell us, the first symptoms of bubonic plague are chills, headache and backache, restlessness and high fever, followed rapidly by prostration. with when in 1 or 2 days from the onset a bubo develops, which is often followed by secondary smaller swellings elsewhere on the body. Vomiting and delirium are common. Death usually follows in a further 3 to 4 days. Though Demussy devotes most of his description to symptoms and prognosis that fit the bubonic form of plague very closely, references to the spitting of blood and to death on the very day the illness took possession fit well the two other variants, pneumonic and septicemic plague. 4th century authorities tell us that no one who vomited blood survived, which is the case with untreated pneumonic plague. Victims who are reported as dying suddenly during the Black Death, often within hours of the onset of illness and without exhibiting external signs, could well have been victims of the rarer but equally lethal septicemic variant, in which the plague bacteria passed directly into the bloodstream. So the concept of medicine at this time could absolutely not account for what was happening in the bubonic plague. The concept of medicine had nothing to do with disease and contagion, really. It had to do with balancing the 4 humors that they believed to be in the body. And when the 4 humors got out of balance, then illness arose. And so the idea that people would spread illness one from to another, which was clearly happening here, was something their concept of medicine really couldn't account for. And yet they had to accept that the plague was passing from person to person. In this book on the Black Death that I'm reading, John Hatcher tries what some historians occasionally try when they get frustrated by the lack of documentary evidence, that there are no accounts written by people, no diaries written by survivors of the plague, because there were few survivors of the plague, and also not written by people who had their family die from the plague. Most people were illiterate. So there's very little documentary evidence about the plague came and hit my family, and this is the effect that it had on us. Or the plague came, I was the mayor of this village, and the plague came and hit the village, and this is how it destroyed the village. There are legal records that record deaths and the passing on of land and responsibilities, but they don't record any emotional response to what was happening. And so from that frustration, John Hatcher has written a book on the Black Death, which is partially a recounting of the facts that we know and partially an imaginative fiction based on legal records about how the plague came to a village called Walsham in England, a real village that actually exists and actually has these records, these property records, but of which there's no actual account of what the people were thinking. And the primary character in this kind of novelization of the Black Death is a priest whose name is John. And in this passage that I'm going to read, he has gone to the local abbey and he is talking to the person who is the infirmerer, which is basically the monk who is in charge of the health of the monastery and the surrounding countryside, and the closest thing that they have to a doctor. And so the priest, John, has gone to see what he can find out about the plague, because the monasteries are where knowledge accumulates. And if anyone knows what's going on in the plague, it will be the people in the monastery. And so the infirmer, the doctor, Richard, starts out telling him what he has learned about the plague. And he says, "This much I do know for certain. The chance of infection for a healthy person is greatly increased by inhaling air breathed out by those who are sick, even if that healthy person is a priest administering the last rites. Further, it has many times been reported by learned doctors and confirmed in the books that an airy spirit of poisonous vapor is emitted by the eyes when someone is heavily infected and close to death, and that this vapor can pass on the sickness merely by striking the eye of a bystander. John interrupted. This must be how people have become infected, even though they have scrupulously avoided any intimate contact with the sick. Richard impatiently waved him quiet. For these reasons, I conclude that the best means by far of avoiding catching the plague is not only to shun all contact with other people when plague is in your town or village, but to flee immediately from where the plague is. If you have sense, you should flee even from where it is threatening to come. As the experts have learned across Europe, if you wish to stay alive, flee the plague quickly, go far away, and return as late as possible. But of course, the informer added, all this expert advice, so painstakingly gathered, is of no use whatever to either of us, because a priest cannot desert his flock, nor a monk flee his cloister. As as horrifying as it is to think about, and it was horrifying to everyone to think about family members running away from other family members because they didn't want to get sick and die. As horrifying as it was to think to those people to think about the dead lying unburied because no one would come near them. Think about the idea that you can catch a disease from someone by looking them in the eye. And how far apart you would have to be from each other. How much lack of care you would have to give to the sick and dying to keep that kind of distance. Not just so that you didn't breathe their air, but so you didn't look them in the eye. And consider in this account that they say nothing about fleas, which we think of as having carried at least part of the plague, fleas which would account for how you could get the plague if you were not close enough to breathe air. But there's nothing about fleas in there. It's all about air and looking someone in the eye. And then the horror of knowing that if you did not flee, you would probably get sick, but it was your job as a priest or a monk to give last rites and to bury the dead. One of the things that strikes me as I read this book is that we also are living through a partial apocalypse in which the things that we have believed, that we grew up believing, were a normal part of a civil society, things like empathy, an embrace of equality, of compassion, of justice, of knowledge, of wisdom, all of these things are being overturned. We are subject to people who are saying that none of this is part of civil society. And we are urged to embrace as our ideal the supremacy and survival of only the fittest. And most times, the fittest means either the richest or the person with the most guns. And in the face of this partial apocalypse, there is a clear instinct to flee, to hide, to get as far away as possible from the plague. As Richard the Informer says, if you wish to stay alive, flee the plague quickly, go far away, and return as late as possible. In this case, the plague isn't a fever, but the embrace of ignorance and force and cruelty and oppressive power and the attempt to control thought. But here is how our times harshly apocalyptic as they may be, are not like the plague. This miasma of hatred and cruelty does not need to be contagious. And when we gather into our fellowship, when we gather in our cave behind the falls of the Niagara, we don't gather to flee, but just to remind ourselves that the world that we are immersed in is actually not the real world. The real world is in our fellowship, is in our love for one another. And therefore, because we are gathered into these fellowships of Christian love, we are still called to love all of our brothers and sisters, including our enemies. In a certain way, it is easy for me to feel superior to the medieval doctors who believed that you could catch the plague from looking a sick person in the eye. And yet I think of every time I have avoided the eyes of someone who was poor, of someone who was drunk, of someone who was not like me. When I'm driving down the interstate in Dayton and there are people on the corners at the stoplight saying, "Help, homeless." I try to park. As I pull up to the light, I try to be in the lane, not next to them, but one lane over so I don't have to look them in the eye. Why is that actually? I can't catch what they have, but it prevents me from having to love them. And yet there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. In the time of the Black Death, even the most loving, even those most involved in the life of the Christian church, had to make the choice that Bonhoeffer warned us about. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Unlike in 1348 and 1349, in 2025, we can choose love without automatically choosing death. But to follow Christ, we must still choose love.